Hi there, this is Derek, and we're on week 8 of the novel writing basics, and we're going to talk about the conclusion of your novel, or the finale. So I started with this picture of a lit fuse, and you kind of want to think about your story outline as one long fuse that's slowly burning, so there's conflict and tension that's being ignited, and it's creeping closer and closer towards something that is going to explode. And even if some of this stuff is small or low stakes or low risk while it's happening, by the time you get to the ending, it's going to feel inevitable or necessary. And partly that's what we're going to do in the editing phase, is take away all of the stuff that's not part of this fuse. And we're also going to be adding dynamite or gunpowder or whatever else into the final package to give it a bigger emotional impact. So there's the chance, if you just have a lot of interesting things happening, either this fuse is just going to fizzle out if it's not wound tightly or constructed well, if there are gaps in the narrative, or if some part of this fuse is way over here, then this light will just go out. Readers will lose interest. The momentum will be gone. So you have to make sure that it's all relevant, it's all going somewhere, and there's always conflict. There's always a bright spark of conflict or tension. But at the same time, readers are going to expect that if they follow through to the end, there's going to be a payout. In other words, all of these little things mattered because they led up to a point of crucial change. This doesn't have to be an actual fight scene or like an actual explosion, but it should feel like a huge transformative event to your main character. So hopefully you've been doing some writing the last few weeks and have made it part of the way through these first 3 sections. And what's kind of important to realize is that even past the midpoint, even when they decide to take a more active role, they're still going to be avoiding pain or trauma. They are going to have their own instincts or belief or confidence, and they're going to feel like, it's possible that they will win and survive without giving up the things that they want most. And the point of all of this is just to show them clinging on to the things that they don't want to change. So showing their inner fears or inhibitions, or showing, a gradual understanding or awareness of what they actually want or what they really care about. So that when they finally get to this final battle, there's going to be a period of selflessness, when they realize that in order to transcend the difficulty or the challenge or the villain, they're going to have to give up what they want most. And so you can also see that this final battle scene, even though it's kind of written in red here, and the final battle is really just going to be one scene, there's still about 6 chapters of build-up and resolution around that final battle scene to put it in context. Because if it's just a little fight or something, the action sequence, no matter how good the action is not going to be satisfying unless we know all of the stakes and risks that have led here. Until we know what the hero is fighting for and why it matters and why they're willing to risk so much, and what they're facing to lose or what they may have to give up. Until we really understand how deeply traumatic and painful this final battle experience is, it's just not going to have an emotionally satisfying impact. That said, you may have to decide when the book is actually over, and I've seen some writers struggle finding the ending to their story. And if you remember what I said at the beginning of this course, a novel or a story has a beginning and an end. So in real life, there's not really as much clear structure, which means a lot of little things happen, but life keeps going. Nothing really has a profound, dramatic, transformative, emotional impact in real life. Possibly in retrospect, people can say that they have like an epiphany moment or this, enlightenment moment when everything changed. But that's often a really personal, emotional journey. To other people, it may not even look like a big deal, but for characters or personalities, individuals, they will have this period of reckoning or transformation where their viewpoint shifts, their self-understanding shifts. And that's kind of the end, because a story is about an emotional change in an individual character. And it usually happens after a significant period of resistance. So for most of the book, the main character has been avoiding conflict, which could be maybe it's a relationship that they're afraid of, maybe it's dealing with a relationship with their parents or their romantic interest. It may be a fear that they have of something and they have to confront their deepest fear in order to get what they want. Or if it's not as character focused, it could be an external villain or antagonist that they have to thwart or defeat. Either the villain is coming after them directly and they have to defeat him to survive or protect those that they care about, or the villain has a dastardly plan set in motion and the hero has to put themselves in danger to stop that plan for the greater good. So at some point, the hero will realize that avoidance is no longer an option and that they're going to have to confront whatever they are afraid of or whatever they've been avoiding for most of the novel. They're going to have to confront it. And through that confrontation, they're going to be forced to change, either by facing their worst fears or having a deep reckoning or a conversation that they've been afraid to have, or admitting their deepest feelings, or possibly relinquishing what they want, any hope for what they want. Sometimes you have like a selfless romance scene where the love interest will say something like, "I love you, so I'm letting you go. I would rather have you be happy than have you be with me." And so often when the final confrontation scene comes about, it's a matter of selflessness where the character chooses to put other people's feelings or safety first, even though it means giving up what they actually want. At the same time, keep in mind, this is still just a rough draft. This is your first rough draft, and we are still just focusing on what actually happened. So if you don't have all the context figured out yet about why this final battle was necessary or what it means, that's okay. A quote I really like from Neil Gaiman is to write down everything that happens in this story. This was in response to a question about how to plot a book, and the answer was write down everything that happens, and then in the second draft to make it look like you knew what you were doing all along. So in the first draft, even if you've plotted really carefully, you'll probably still be figuring some things out. So it's okay to just write something and have some kind of final reckoning moment. It's got to have a great deal of conflict or tension or violence. Earlier we talked about suspense and tension. Suspense is in the things that you don't know. It's in the missing information. And tension is in the dangers that are unrealized that might happen in the future. So by the end of the book, most of that suspense should be resolved because we've been giving out all of the information. And some of the information won't happen until here. This final battle, as I mentioned, could actually be these 3 chapters. So not just one scene. And I actually like and recommend that they lose the final battle at first. But then they have an unexpected victory, probably because they've learned something new, whether it's something new about themselves or newfound strength or resolve Or, as often happens, there's a scene where the villain is confessing their plans and there is some new information that comes to light. So in the final battle scene that I just wrote, I think I've talked before about the vampire book I was working on. I got it finished this week. And she's not actually, my protagonist is not actually trying to go and fight the king. She's just trying to turn off this giant machine that he has that's poisoning the world. So that's her aim. She's trying to save humanity by turning off this machine. But of course, the vampire king shows up and they fight on the volcano mountaintop. And it's a pretty good fight scene. There's a lot of, fighting. It wouldn't be enough for her to just fight and win. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So she has to actually fight and lose at first. Then someone, her love interest, comes and helps out a little bit, but he's also not strong enough to defeat his father, who's the king. But while the king is gloating, he reveals some new information and he makes some additional threats about people that she cares about. She has a couple of young siblings and he makes some really terrible threats about what's going to happen to her siblings after he's won and she's defeated. So it kind of gives her newfound resolve where she's not just fighting for saving humanity, but she's also fighting to save her siblings because of something that the king has said, assuming that he's already won. So my point was just, you can start with the action first. You can start with the fight scene first. And we will talk more about fixing those scenes and improving the description and the details, the action, the dialogue. That can all be fixed later. The first part is just making sure that things happen and that things are in the right place. And even in the first week of editing, which we're going to start next week, we'll still be focused on deleting scenes or moving things around to make sure that they fit. Because if you don't have this kind of ticking clock or burning fuse leading up to a big confrontation, then the novel might just kind of fizzle out or fall apart or feel unsatisfying. But the kind of nice thing is that you can reorganize and restructure a little bit to create more of a linear experience later. Which just means you may have a bunch of random cool scenes that don't necessarily form part of that burning fuse, but you can add a little bit of direction every once in a while, reminding readers of the stakes, keeping characters focused on what's actually important, what's actually happening, so that it seems like you have a linear, direct timeline leading up to an inevitable conclusion. So it's fine if it's not all there yet. Write it the first time, figure out what's actually going to happen. Later you can go back and make it look like, which is true. The first time you write something, you probably don't know how it's going to turn out. You may be surprised by what actually happens in the end. It may not be exactly what you had planned. But you can always substitute what you thought would be a good idea for whatever comes up. You're probably going to have better ideas about what happens. And by better, it's going to have more of an emotional impact. It's going to matter more. It's going to hurt more. And you can do that either by improving the description to have more epic descriptions or scenery or backdrop, or by boosting the emotional resonance and make it really hurt, which we called twisting the knife in a previous video. So in this video, I'm just going to talk about some common problems I see when you're trying to write the final battle or conclusion. And the big one will be, what if you don't have a main story? So I mentioned the story completes when the main story is resolved, but if you don't have a whole main linear story, it can feel like you're not really sure when to wrap things up. So the final battle is going to be the scene of the most dramatic conflict, which means not only is it going to be the biggest actual physical conflict, which means, a fight scene, or it's the love interest rushing through the airport and shouting or pushing past the security guards to confess their feelings. So it's going to appear dramatic and out of character. There's going to be some risk involved, even if it's a contemporary story without a lot of violence or supernatural effects. So visually, you want to build it up. And you've probably already had some small conflicts or arguments before, but since characters generally try to avoid conflict, they probably haven't boiled over. And so we're going to get to this point where the character is facing an enormous challenge, even if it doesn't, maybe it doesn't manifest in the real world as something that other people see and appreciate as dangerous. For them, it's still going to feel really terrifying. You may not have revealed who the antagonist is or what's actually going on until late in the book. So it may not appear at first as if you have a linear timeline or one villain. But there should be something or someone pulling the strings who is making things happen that threaten the main character's life or environment or allies. And at some point, the main character will go out and try to confront or stop whatever this thing is that's impacting them in a negative way. So this could be a survival quest or a glory quest. It could be just running and trying to survive, but at some point the monster catches up with them. The monster's creeping in and getting closer and closer, and at some point they just can't escape it anymore. They're trapped in a corner or they're stuck up in a tree or whatever. They're just trying to survive, and at some point they can't avoid the danger any longer, and there's a forced battle. Or it can be a glory scene where the knight or the protagonist decides to go out and meet danger head on, even though they should be fully aware of the chances of failing or the real risks. There will also probably be a sense of acceptance or confrontation. So acceptance would be, okay, I can't ignore this conflict. No matter what I do, it's always going to find me. I'm never going to be able to be free or happy. I don't want to live like this anymore. I don't want to be on the run my entire life. So they accept the danger, even though the consequences will probably be negative, even if they're accepting their own potential demise. Or it could be a confrontation where they are seeking out danger because they have to end the threat, either for their own personal safety and sanity, or because the threat is endangering something else that they care about, and they have to go out and stop the villain or the bad thing from happening. But these are all kind of motivation focused, and the nice thing about motivation is it's actually a really small piece of the puzzle. It's really important to get right, but it's not very long. So you can, fix the motivation in just a handful of sentences here or there to properly justify why your character feels the need to respond to this threat. But it's not actually going to change most of the scenes or most of the action or the final battle sequence or dialogue or anything. So that's, even if you haven't figured all of that out yet, it is really important to figure out the motivation, but that's something we can do at a later stage. More importantly, as we start the editing process, will be to figure out what the main story is so we know where it's going and what the ending has to be. But you can also do it backwards and just figure out what your dramatic final moment is going to look like, and then figure out what you have to do to get your characters to that place. I actually usually start and know my final battle scenes pretty early on. I know what they're going to look like and where they're going to be. And then it takes me a while to figure out what happens in the meantime to build the characters up to what they need to learn about the world and themselves to figure out where they have to go and who's doing what before they can show up at the right place in the right time. We did talk about having a scene checklist earlier, but in review really quickly, every scene should deepen the characters, show some character depth or their backstory or emotional attachment, reveal tension or conflict. Every scene should have increased context about what's going on, which will increase readers' understanding and also the tension, because readers have to understand the stakes and the motivations before they figure out where the tension and the conflict is. And also there can be some kind of nice fun scenes that just show the world that's worth saving. All of these come together because the motivation, like I said, is really important, and that's part of it. You have to get your characters to a emotional place where they are ready to risk everything. You kind of have to strip them down, take everything away from them, until they realize they've got nothing else to lose. There's no way to avoid this battle. And also, hopefully, if you can, you want to make this battle or villain or conflict specific to that character, to your main character, whether it's the fatal flaw that they have to overcome or the deep-seated fear. Or it could be, if it's a young adult novel, it's really common to have a chosen one where, there was a prophecy about a savior and it was inevitable that they would rise up to be the hero. So that said, the final battle scene really is the core important chapter or scene of the book. It's the thing that everything has been building up towards. So here are a few points just on creating a more gripping battle scene. So once you get to the chief conflict in the final battle scene, here you can see these two guys fighting, and Wonder Woman is kind of surprised and watching them. But there's a lot of drama happening in this scene, so I'm going to see if I can break this down a little bit. It's not just about the fighting. There's a lot of conflict based on the characterization and what we know about the backstory of these three characters. There's actually a movie about Superman fighting Batman, and it may seem kind of weird because they're both superheroes. They're both, trying to do what they think is right, but they have different approaches. Batman is more of a dark, brooding anti-hero. He's actually fully human, and he just uses technology and special gear and gadgets to fight the bad guys, but he's also willing to get his hands dirty and kind of give in to his darker human impulses. So sometimes he may feel like it's necessary to kill the villain because that's the only way to get lasting justice, whereas Superman is more of a consummate hero who is always on the side of good. And because he's so powerful, because he has superpowers and he's an alien, he has to be really careful about his definition of justice. He has to make sure that he is considered the good guy and not the alien invader. So he will usually subdue the villains, which is pretty easy for him, but not kill the villains, which would stop him from doing the role that he's kind of worked out with the humans. If the humans see him as just fighting the bad guys but leaving the justice up to the police and the courts, they'll kind of let him exist. Whereas if Superman just started randomly killing people without justifying his actions or explaining himself, he would get into a bunch of other trouble he doesn't want. And Wonder Woman is more sort of an in-between. She's more like a Greek goddess, so she has some supernatural abilities, but she's more heavily invested in the humanity side of the conflict. And you don't always need a character arc that makes the villain sympathetic. You want to try not to have your villain be two-dimensional, which means they are just pure evil. They do bad things because they are bad. That makes them unrealistic because humans, like all conscious characters, they will do what they believe is best for them. They will have motivations. They may do the wrong things, but it will seem rational to them. So if you have villains that are just evil for no reason, and it's okay if it's a lightning storm or an earthquake or possibly like an alien invasion, but if you have a real character and you want to make them seem more believable or realistic, you want to give them deeper motivations than just being evil. And so in this conflict, Wonder Woman is kind of confused because she doesn't know which of these guys has it right. This is really deep, complicated moral issues. It's a moral quandary about the nature of good and evil and the nature of power and what, who is the hero, who is the villain. You don't necessarily want to go too deep down that road, because if you make both characters equally heroic, then readers aren't really going to know who to root for. They're not going to feel good when the hero wins and they are victorious against the antagonist. So you want to make sure that you can make, maybe the villain is a little bit sympathetic, but the hero is still justified in pursuing their demise. There have been some books or video games that have really tried to go too far in this direction. Even a lot of these Batman movies have gone too far in this direction, where it's really hard to tell who is the hero and who's the bad guy, to the extent that in recent years there's been a whole new slew of movies and video games that are romanticizing the villain. So you have the villains coming out with their own movies as misunderstood anti-heroes. The problem is, if you have a hero who is just defeating a bunch of bad guys, if those bad guys are too three-dimensional, then it's possible to sympathize with them, and that makes the hero the bad guy. And that's dangerous, because if your readers feel bad about your hero defeating the bad guys, they're not gonna feel satisfied when they get to the end of the book. They're gonna feel kind of confused. So the easy solution is usually, when they're fighting bad guys, you have them be faceless. And if you watch any movies, usually the main villain, they show his face, but the main villain has hundreds of robots or soldiers who are wearing masks or whatever, that they're not human because we can't see their faces, so we don't feel bad when the hero has to fight off the angry hordes and fight through the battle to get to the villain. Anyway, there's also potentially some conflict here, because we don't know if these two are friends or who she's rooting for. She's probably friendly with both of them. I don't think she's having any romantic history with either of these two specific characters, but they inhabit the same world, so they're probably familiar with each other. Because the other important thing is that emotion is almost always relationship based. So if it's just fighting and violence and chaos, it may be exciting, but it won't be emotionally satisfying. The emotion comes from the relationships between the characters. But anyway, in your final battle scenes, it must be extremely challenging, so much bigger and more difficult than anything the character could have expected, and also bigger than anything that's already happened. I also added one thing here, which is inner-outer conflict. I'm not sure where I talked about this before, but in some blog post or video, I had this idea that you see often in movies, which is the hero is fighting the villain one-on-one. It's an up-close, personal battle that's taking place. But at the same time, there's a bigger conflict raging somewhere else, where their forces or the allies, often the allies are they're trying to accomplish a different goal, or either they're the distraction or the hero is a distraction, or the hero has to complete one critical task to turn the tide of war. So the hero is doing the risky thing, trying to flip the switch and take down the shields so that the allies can attack. And until the hero defeats the antagonist and flips the switch, everybody else is spinning their wheels. So the outer conflict it's just to put kind of more pressure on this inside conflict where the hero is directly facing off with the antagonist. You have to show that it really matters, that this battle really matters, not only to those two characters, but to everybody else. So if you can set it up where all of the other characters are waiting and hoping for the hero to come through, and everybody else is counting on them, and if the hero doesn't pull through, then everything is going to be destroyed. That's just a kind of nice way to show a deeper conflict. You can also give the villain an unexpected secret power or weapon. In this battle, for example, Superman is basically immortal and bulletproof. There's no way to hurt Superman, so no conflict can ever be satisfying because there's no real stakes or risk for Superman. Everything he goes into, there's no real fear or threat because he's invulnerable. So what has to happen is the invention of kryptonite, because only kryptonite allows for final battle scenes that are actually gripping and satisfying. So in all of the Superman movies, there's always a point where he's fighting off against the main villain and the villain has kryptonite, and suddenly he's completely weak and at the mercy of the villain. And that has to happen over and over again because otherwise there's no way to create a satisfying battle scene. You can also, when you want to slow things down, focus on the small details. So we'll talk more about this later under description. And this isn't necessarily something I would add right now because the first time you write a battle scene, it's just going to be really rough and messy anyway. But whenever you want readers to feel the impact of a scene, then you zoom in with the camera. When you want them to see the big effect or the big picture, or to explore the world, you can zoom out. So like when they're somewhere new and they're looking around at the scenery and they're all saying, wow, this is amazing, then you can zoom out with the camera and kind of show the big scene. But when you want to show the conflict or especially the pain, then you need to zoom in close and focus on the little details. This also makes it kind of more immediate when the way that you handle description is always going to be relevant to what your character is paying attention to. So if they're walking into a new location, then they're exploring, they're going to be looking at everything. But if someone jumps out with a knife, the only thing they're going to pay attention to is where that knife is. They're going to be looking at the blade of that knife. They're going to be studying the villain's facial expressions and the muscles of his shoulders or his legs, to see how they're going to move or where they're going to attack. So depending on how much anxiety the character is feeling or how much adrenaline, they're going to zoom in on the small details. So the more danger, the more adrenaline that's happening in the scene, the bigger conflict in the scene, the smaller details. You can also break up the fight scene with banter, threats, or gloating. There can be a bit of character. Usually there's, they trade a few blows and then they stalk around each other and offer threats. And like I said, usually the villain wins at first. So that's when they start gloating. And then somehow when the hero seems like he's defeated, he rallies and comes back. The interesting thing is something probably has to happen before that transition. So he has to be brought completely low and realize that he's failed and realize that he's facing mortality possibly before he gets to that point where he can reach into himself and find the inner strength or the reason to keep fighting. So it could be a response to something the character said. It could be something he notices. Maybe he's lying there bleeding out, and then he has a memory or a dream or something reminds him of something, or somebody else he knows is in danger. So there's some little point of change where the character really comes to grip with his own potential death or failure, and then comes back stronger. So this is why I say triple the stakes, because the character already knows what they're fighting for and why it's important, but they may think, once they've been defeated, there's probably a few seconds of icy fear where they have to remind themselves what's going to happen next. Like, I wasn't expecting this, I thought I would win, the villain has defeated me, and they probably will think about the stakes. Like, if I lose, everybody's counting on me, he's going to take over the universe or destroy Earth or whatever. So the stakes get even higher, which forces a heroic response. And this will probably be related to a real personal risk or external risk, which means, like I mentioned earlier, Superman has to have vulnerability or else there's no real risk. If they go in there all confident and they defeat the villains pretty easily, that's not going to be a satisfying final battle scene. There should be some personal risk, like they may die or they may lose everything that they care about, and also probably some external risk. Somebody else is going to get hurt, or the villain is going to continue his campaign of evil. They may also have a death realization, which just means they realize that they may die. And even if it's not a physical death, even if it's metaphorical, like I said earlier with something like a contemporary or a contemporary romance, they may have been avoiding what they think will kill them their entire lives, and they realize that actually wasn't the case. There was a young adult novel that got turned into a movie about a girl who was basically a hypochondriac, and her mother had her locked up in a vacuum-sealed house, and she could never leave. And then she fell in love with a boy, and she risked everything to leave the house for him, knowing that she might die. Like, her desire for love was stronger than her desire to live. And in the movie that I just finished watching, the final line was, I'd rather die at your side than live another day without you, which is sort of common. And it's just that idea where even if there's not an actual physical danger or the possibility of a real death, they still feel like they can no longer go on the way that they were living. The life that they had been clinging to, the identity they had been clinging to, they've realized it's not enough anymore, and they're willing to risk it all and be ready to give it up. And even realizing that that's a potential possibility, even realizing what they have to lose, they're still going to put everything down on the table and give it their all, because the possibility is worth fighting for, even if the chances are slim. Finally, in an epic arena, you can just add kind of greater and greater description. So this is going to depend on the genre that you're writing, but bigger weapons, bigger villains, or forces of the enemy, or creatures or monsters to battle. This is basically like the boss battle. So if you play video games, for example, first you have to earn your place in the arena by going through all of the levels and successfully completing all the challenges, even to get a face-to-face with the main boss. But you also have to develop your stamina and your skills and your health bar, and then you have to go on this total epic side quest to claim this secret weapon, which is the only thing that can defeat the boss. And even after all that, the boss is going to be more challenging and have some unexpected obstacles. So a good boss in video games, usually it's not just the boss. The boss will also be shooting fancy weapons, or they'll have attack animals or side maybe foes. So it's not just as simple as fighting the boss head on. The boss is going to have a whole bunch of other things that you have to confront or defeat. at the same time before the boss is vulnerable, and you may only have a few seconds in between those attacks to be able to use the magic weapon and defeat them in the right way. In something like a romance or a contemporary, you can increase the emotional stakes by forcing the character to do the thing that they hate the most or that they fear the most. So maybe if they're afraid of water and you give them a tragic backstory about how their parents died on a cruise, maybe through the whole romantic interlude, she has always wanted to quit her job and go on a round-the-world cruise, and he wants her to just stay with him in his normal life because he doesn't want to get on a cruise ship because that's how his parents died, and that's really traumatic for him. So it's not enough for him to realize he cares about her and to track her down and confess his love. He has to, she's leaving on a cruise ship, which is his greatest fear, and he has to jump off the dock and swim towards her through the water to catch up so that she sees him confronting his biggest fear and knows that she means that much to her. She means that much to him, where she knows he's willing to risk everything. She knows how hard this is and how difficult this was for him to put himself out there like that. But it could also be, rather than, he goes and wants to just have a quiet moment and talk about his feelings, but she's sitting there with all of her best friends who hate him, who have been tearing him down, or possibly his parents or his boss or like anybody else he's kind of intimidated by, and he has to make a public declaration of love, of affection. In another movie, I think it was a Happy Madison movie, there was an episode when the protagonist was a kid where he kissed a girl and a bully pulled down his pants and showed his underwear, and all the kids laughed at him. So now as an adult, he doesn't like to kiss in public. He's really he's traumatized by that experience, and he doesn't like to kiss his girlfriend in public, and that bothers her because she wants him to feel comfortable with their relationship. So finally, at the end, he has to go out and confess his love in a big way and kiss her in front of a whole baseball stadium full of strangers, which is his biggest fear. So my point is that even in the epic arena, it's not only about the external conflict, it's also showing the character overcoming their deepest fear, which again is not strictly necessary for all types of books or for all kinds of commercial fiction, but it can definitely increase the emotional catharsis that happens, which just means your readers will feel it on a deeper level. They will understand how much the hero has overcome and how much they're giving up and what they're risking, because you have to make this battle as difficult as possible, not only on a physical level, but also on a deep emotional level, because stories worth telling are the ones where the characters are forced to change. And finally, at the end of the novel, you're going to be wrapping up loose ends or filling in story holes. So if you have any unanswered questions about what actually happened, there's probably going to be a period after the villain has been defeated where some of that gets wrapped up. And this could be a final chapter, or it could work as an epilogue. However, the story is basically over when the enemy or the threat is defeated. So it's possible to just, especially if you're writing a series, it's possible to end on a cliffhanger, which just means you end at peak tension or peak drama or conflict. And cliffhangers are really brutal emotionally because they'll really hit readers hard, but they'll also be really angry and dissatisfied. So if you have a sequel up right away and they can keep reading, that's okay, but they may also feel cheated because that first book didn't get resolved. In a series, the threat may not be completely defeated. In something like the Harry Potter series, there's actually a whole sequence of side villains, which aren't the main antagonists, but are smaller forces of the antagonist. If it's something more episodic, like a cozy mystery or a thriller, you might have one protagonist who is solving different crimes every book, so there's always a new puzzle or antagonist or crime. If this is something like an epic fantasy or a sci-fi, if it's really character-based, there will probably be something like the return to the status quo, which could be the ordinary world, or just wherever things started in chapter 1. There'll be some reference back to those initial scenes or characters, but now the protagonist has changed, which is kind of why I put this picture here, where a normal day may be sitting and reading the newspaper, which might have felt safe or relaxing at the beginning, but now because the character has been through much, it's through so much, it's difficult for the protagonist to just sit still and pay attention to ordinary, mundane things, especially if they've learned about other forces out there or new powers or new characters. They will probably feel like either the world is burning and they have to continue the fight because they can't turn their back on the conflict, or just they've kind of burnt their bridges and the ordinary world doesn't really hold any draw or satisfaction for them anymore. It could be a really quick, happy resolution or relationship. Often in something like a detective thriller, there's a lot of stress on the relationship because the protagonist is going down this dark rabbit hole trying to solve a crime and confront this dastardly villain, and they kind of lose themselves a little bit. It puts a lot of stress and pressure on the relationship. The relationship might break down, the wife might leave with the kids or something, and after he's finally solved the case and defeated the bad guy, he may have a newfound appreciation for his family, and he'll go back and try to fix things because he's maybe at the beginning of the book he was dissatisfied in the relationship. At the end of the book, through that traumatic experience of solving the crime, he has a new appreciation for the ordinary life that was frustrating before but now gives him new meaning. But if it's a series, it could also be the case that all they've really done is survive the attack for the moment. They know that the enemy and the enemy's forces are still out there. They know that the threat is still looming. So they may be safe right now today, but they know that there's still conflict to come. But they will have enough space and safety to sit around and talk to each other, which shouldn't have been the case for most of the book. For most of the book, they would have been driven to action. There would have been enough conflict to keep them from sharing their feelings or their thoughts with each other. But now that most of the conflict is over, they can finally tell each other what's been going on or how they were feeling, or just ask each other questions about, why did that happen? Maybe some of them have missing pieces of information that only comes together at the end in the epilogue or in the final chapter, where they can kind of look back and finally kind of see how all the pieces fit together and what was actually going on. So just one final point down here is that if you've done any writing this month and you've tried to write any kind of a story, that's already a huge challenge, and I think you should acknowledge and appreciate what you've accomplished. I also think writing a book or a novel can be a lot of fun. It can be really enjoyable and exciting, but it can also be more draining and more difficult than a lot of other things or projects that you've probably started. So if you've felt frustrated or overwhelmed at any point, if you have a messy first draft that you're not really happy with right now, that's completely normal. And you should still feel really proud of the effort that you've put in and any of the writing that you've done, because there's not really any such thing as mistakes. It's all progress. You're always going to be learning how to do better. And you have to kind of write badly first and become comfortable with it before you practice enough to start getting better. I also think that writing a book and editing or revising a book are two really, really different things. They take very different kinds of creative production. One may feel more natural or comfortable for you. One may feel more restrictive. And so while I try to focus on plotting and editing because that's easier for me, you may feel more like it's more fun just to write and not worry about any of that stuff. We all have different strengths and weaknesses, but we're all gonna have to wrestle with the stuff that's not as much fun. And since working on a novel can be such an enormous amount of energy and time, it's really important to take breaks and try to do something else that you enjoy. Take a break, go out in nature, take a walk, put your feet in the grass, play video games, maybe read other books, anything you can do kind of to veg out a little bit. This is also an enormous use of brain power, and you may feel more tired and more drained. You may feel yourself sleeping more than you usually do when you're working on a book. You may feel more dissatisfied or frustrated than you usually do. So it's just kind of important to acknowledge that and to celebrate all of your small wins and make sure you're taking enough time for doing things that you enjoy, that make you happy. I'm going to leave the comments on this video in the course, so if you want to share an excerpt from your story, something that you particularly like, a dialogue or a scene, or if you want to put your final battle or confrontation, or whatever else you want to share in the comments, that's fine too. A lot of writers actually suggest once you finish your rough draft that you put it down for a week or two, or some people even say like 3 months, just to give yourself some mental space from it before you come back with fresh eyes. But I'm going to go ahead and keep going with this course and start the editing process next week. So if you want to take some extra time off and come back to the course later once you're ready to start editing, that's completely fine too. You don't feel like you have to, if you're feeling burnt out or stressed, or if you just want to kind of, take a few weeks off and enjoy yourself, you can come back to the course anytime and go through the materials at your own pace. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.